Hi, and welcome to Goop Book Club. I'm Kiki Koroshetz, an editor here at Goop and the ringleader of our book club. If this is your first time joining, welcome. If you've been here every month, thank you so much for coming back. As always, I'll just remind you, you can go to goop.com/goopbookclub for more info at any point. Every month, we pick a book and we read it together. We have small members-only chats on Zoom. We have Q&As with the authors, we post excerpts, and my favorite part is at the end of the month, I get to show up here and talk live with our author, and I will be announcing our author today in just a moment. As a reminder, we are live. You can drop in questions for Ashley into the chat box in YouTube, and the team will get them over to me. As always, I will be announcing our next book. This is going to be our September pick at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. So, this month, we have been reading Immediate Family by Ashley Nelson Levy. This is Ashley's first book, and I'm going to be that annoying person that says, I hope it's the first of many. Ashley is also the co-founder of a brilliant publisher called Transit, and we'll maybe get to talk a little bit about that too. But first, I just want to say, Immediately Family, for everyone who's read, you know this book is absolutely stunning, breathtaking. It begins with the night before Danny's wedding, when his sister is still trying to make sense of their story and their speech. She's been asked to give a toast at his wedding. And what unfolds is part a love letter from a sister to a brother that includes an apology and a promise. And it's a beautiful snapshot of a family and so much more. It boggles my mind. We were talking about it in our small book club Zoom yesterday, how this book is only 170 pages and it packs so much into it. It made me rethink my feelings and thoughts on adoption and IVF and infertility and desires and ambivalences around motherhood, and how different stories and mythologies and history influence the way that we even think of the notion of a family. So I absolutely loved it. I have so much to ask Ashley about, and Ashley, thank you for being our August book club pick, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Kiki. Thanks so much for having me. When I heard it was the August book club pick, I felt like I'd won an Oscar or something. So thank you so much. So exciting.
Oh my gosh, that's so sweet. I'm so excited. And Ashley, I was thinking maybe if you could start by reading that opening section from the book, and then we could kind of dive in. Does that work?
Yeah, that sounds great. So,
okay, perfect.
Right, as Kiki said, I'll just be reading the first opening section of the book. Last night I told you that today might be hard for us. And you said why? And I said, because we'll be married and all grown up. And you said, I'm already grown up. And gave me a look that I've never seen on any face but yours. A kind of mischievous pride that wavers between the certainty of your own truths and the question of whether you'll get away with them. I was supposed to be with our mother, helping fuss over the bride, your soon-to-be wife. But instead I made my way over to your corner of the Mexican restaurant during the rehearsal dinner. Over your head was a red piñata, and behind you was a large dark window that a few hours before had held the beach. You were surrounded by our father's friends, holding a beer that was as much a display item as the piñata. What you probably wanted was just an ice-cold Coke. The other hand was in your pocket, and you hunched a bit in your collared shirt, happy to be noticed, to be at the center somehow, but unsure how to handle your body as a result. A month ago, you had called to ask if I would give you a speech. When I saw your name, I wondered if you were calling to apologize, to set things right between us. But instead, you cut right to the question. This is exactly the way you said it. Will you give me a speech? I listened closely to the sound of your voice, because I didn't hear it as often these days. And rather than being upset like I'd thought, I marveled at the feeling it brought along, like no time had actually passed, like the bad things hadn't happened, or maybe they still had, and regardless, here we were, back to our old selves again. A speech, I said? Isn't that a best man thing? And you explained that your best man had backed out of the speech, maybe even backed out of the wedding. And you didn't want to talk about it because it was a long story, and please. You said please twice. Please give the speech. You were in a bind. Otherwise, would you really be asking your sister? Did Mom put you up to this? I said. And you breathed a loud sigh into the phone, like those brief hits of Northern California wind, that come from nowhere out of the sunshine and push all your hair into your face, unsettling an otherwise pleasant day. The sigh made you sound like you'd lived a long, hard life, even though you were 28 years young and seemed to lose accountability like a sock in the wash. So it's a best sister speech then, I said. I guess, you said. And before we hung up, I reminded you that I hadn't put you on the spot at my wedding. And you reminded me that I hadn't asked. I'll stop there.
I love that passage and that line. This could apply to my brother. Seems to lose accountability like a sock in the wash. So great. Can you talk a little bit about how, kind of like your personal story, how you came to this story and why you chose ultimately for it to be in this letterish form to Danny, to this fictional brother?
Definitely. So, unsurprisingly, I grew up in a transracial adoptive home, and it took many years and many drafts to really understand what part of that experience I was looking to write into. There was kind of a lot of years and drafts of dead ends, I think, ultimately, because I was anxious about what I was trying to do, which I think was really look at the complexities that come up in transracial adoptive homes, while also still really capturing the love that lives there. And that was really important to me. And so I think the novel kind of hit an important moment and found its momentum when I realized that this anxiety that I was feeling was actually really critical kind of characteristic of the narrator's, an ambivalence on her part. She is both resistant to tell kind of her own story and the story of her brother and the story of her family because of inevitable power structures that are in place. You know, she is the white older sister, she's the biological child, but she also feels compelled to tell it because he's an incredibly important person in her life. She loves him, and also in a way because he's asked her to. And so this question of perspective really becomes, again, kind of the driving force of the book. She's really taking a hard look at, how who is telling the story really drives the shape of that story. And she says at the end of the opening section that I started to read, what facts did I know about what should be collected or shed in the story of a person? What right did I have to speak of your life? And then she spends the kind of remaining pages grappling with this question. And so I think as to why it takes this kind of form of it never really calls itself a letter, but it could definitely be understood that way, this kind of second person direct address. Through all these years and drafts of writing it took probably about 7 years in total, even though it's short, it took a long time. It tried on kind of many different hats. There was a large casting call for what this voice was going to sound like. It was a first person novel for a while. It was a very long third person book for a while. And very briefly, it was a nonfiction project. But ultimately, I think when I landed on this more direct second person address to her brother, it really seemed to kind of strike the right intimacy that I think the book is ultimately after. I mean, very quickly it becomes, within I think a few pages, a kind of confessional. And this more intimate form, this kind of imaginative one-way conversation that she's having with him is really allowing her to finally kind of scratch at a lot of the things that have been unspeakable between them, are hard to talk about. And I think alongside the unspeakable parts of their relationship kind of over the course of their life and in like a recent fracture in their relationship as adults, there's also, as you mentioned, kind of the second thread that's coming through the book around her struggles with fertility. And she's also grappling with her own kind of personal language for that and that experience and that grief. And so I think that direct form really kind of allowed her to finally say the things that have gone unsaid for so long.
And it brought a real intimacy in terms of bringing the reader into the narrator's world, because I felt as a reader like I was right there with her in terms of having these desires and these ambivalences and trying to figure out, well, who does this particular story matter to, and like what's shaping this story. So I thought, and you did such a nice job at the end of the book in bringing back to it, where I think, it's not like you close the book and the narrator is like, okay, I figured it all out. It's like she's still questioning herself in terms of like, who has these stories served, you know, in so many ways. Even when you think about with the narrator, you know, had this almost like near obsession where she really wanted to understand and know and be and sow herself into these early years of Danny's life that she wasn't a part of. And, you know, I think in the end, she says, like, these are the stories that were like foundational to me, like in a way, like her life began anew when Danny came to her, when he became part of her family. So this is the way she's making sense of all these things. And I thought the narrator, you did a really wonderful job of giving her that kind of like extra consciousness in terms of her being aware of the way she was shaping her own story and the way she was shaping Danny's. And there were holes that she wanted to fill in that maybe necessarily Danny didn't care to or didn't see things those way, that like particular way.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think, again, this question kind of perspective is a really important one, and one that she grapples with for most of the book. I mean, the book really, one thing that was clear to me with this project is that the book always needed to center her story. And she is very kind of careful about what the boundaries of appropriation are in terms of kind of where her story starts or her perspective starts and his begins. But I think what becomes especially interesting and what was, you know, I think a part that I really liked to write into was just, you know, the question of, you know, what is the ownership of family stories, and how do those boundaries shift and change, or do they when the person you're talking about is your own brother? And so I think the book also makes a lot of kind of formal choices in how it again decides to kind of shift this perspective. You know, she never you know, tries to inhabit his thoughts or kind of assume his place in any way. It asks a lot of questions, and I think the only places where she kind of steps in to imagine are, as you mentioned, kind of the lost narrative of the earlier years of his life before they met, where they don't really have any information, and she kind of imagines what that might have looked like with the few facts they know about where he was born and his birth family. But aside from that, she's really careful about crossing that line, but she's also constantly studying what that line is, and realizes that, yeah, ultimately their stories are inextricably linked. And so it's also impossible for her to talk about herself and the way that she has come to view the many definitions of family and the way she's come to view motherhood, without talking about him, because it's kind of affected her view of everything. So.
Yeah, that was something we talked about and someone in our book club asked about yesterday, which, by the way, was a smaller group than usual with summertime, but it was like probably the best discussion we've ever had. And there was just so much kind of like emotion around it. But kind of remarked on how like we really don't get Danny's point of view. And then a lot of first person, obviously you're primarily getting the narrator, but it did feel really pronounced here. And I think we've all felt your intention with that in terms of that was the narrator wasn't crossing that line. So she wasn't going to kind of give us anything that wasn't like within her own imagination. And as a writer, was there ever a moment where you were kind of imagining like how would Danny respond to this situation, or did you kind of like really try to keep yourself inside the narrator's world in terms of what you were planning out and how you were mapping out the story?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that part of kind of those silences in the book too also speak to kind of the conflict between them that she's also exploring and writing into. There's been like a recent fracture in the relationship, and so part of, I think, what they're both trying to work through is the silences in the relationship. And so I think, you know, often she really doesn't know, but I think that that's exactly right. And again, so much of what the book, I think I wouldn't say conclusion, but I think something that she makes peace with at the end is that there is really only kind of one version of events that she can tell, and it's going to have her markings all over it. And whether that means that she has succeeded or failed, kind of in this request of his to kind of tell the story of him or the story of their life, nonetheless, she's kind of done the best she can to explore some of these unspeakable parts of their relationship and things that she has withheld, that maybe she wishes she hadn't, around her own fertility struggles and other things.
I think another thing, like along those lines, that really struck us as reading the book is how you really wove this larger narrative around like our culture's like feelings towards adoption and towards IVF and motherhood, while kind of like building this like mythology and showing like, okay, these are maybe the reasons why we have these preconceived notions about XYZ, but then always bringing it back to this really singular experience of saying like, yes, all of these things influence this family, but at the same time, like keep in mind, like these were people, you know. And I loved, I mean, I eyeballed the scene where the narrator meets Danny for the first time, and you know, she's so afraid, and she's talking about the fear and excitement being wrapped up, and like first there's another child that comes out, and she's like, that wasn't him, and then you know, she says, you know, though I would have known you from anywhere, and I knew kneeling there that I would be able to love you, and feeling your little body in my arms, I was already getting the process started. And you follow this by this very kind of like, I don't know if monotonous is the right word, but like you're taking us through this process, which is very like bureaucratic and almost kind of like has like this factory like mass like feel. And this was on page 66, where they're going in front of the board to get approval. And it says, we arrived late, but found 18 other white families in line waiting for approval. We were number 7. How strange the scene must have looked. The conveyor belt of white families in the middle of Thailand, circling in and out. The factory feeling of an experience that seemed to all of us so singular. And I thought that was just one example where you brought the point home, where it's like, as a reader, like we could see this in like so many different ways. We can look at them as like, you know, this symbol of other families, but I thought you always brought it back to like such a specific point and reminding us that like at the same time, like this was, and especially with the parents too, like there were so many moments where like the parents' experiences were so singular, even though many others like would relate to them. And I'm just curious how you thought about, especially when you were weaving together like different adoption mythology and looking at literature and how adoption was portrayed, like how you kind of balance what you wanted to show across, you know, culture, but also like how you wanted to make it this like a very specific family portrait.
This is such a good question. I'm only worried that I'm not going to get to all the things I want to say, but I will try, because it's a great question. So I think that you're exactly right. I mean, this is in many ways the singular story of a family, but it was also always very important to me that, and something that's important to the narrator is she is constantly holding up the story of their family against different kind of adoption narratives and frameworks. And she looks at this many different ways. As you mentioned, some of the kind of bigger themes are the historical context. So, you know, the history of transracial adoption in America and how the family kind of fits within that timeline. The kind of the institutional framework of adoption. So, you know, again, she's looking to all this paperwork from the adoption agency. And I think like a good example of that is earlier on when she's reading like this kind of piece of paper from the adoption paperwork called the Life Book. And it's this paper trying to kind of help families, especially when they're adopting children later in life, kind of create a narrative for the beginning of their story together. And she's both kind of critical of this piece of paper because it feels so oversimplified and so reductive. It's basically like insert your child and child's name and country of origin here. But as the book goes on and she kind of is going through their own family mythologies and, you know, the stories that you tell, she also hears the faint echo of kind of that framing and that language around it. And so she, in these kinds of institutional framing, she both is critical of it, but sees the shadow of their family stories within it. So there's that piece. And then, as you mentioned, like the kind of the literary framing. So she's very interested in how the adoption plot has traditionally been represented in literature, like what their families looked like in books. And this was probably one of the most interesting kind of places that the book went for me when I was writing it, because she revisits the Victorians, all the books you read kind of early on in school, and, Austen and Bronte and Eliot. And she starts to see that there are these kind of adoptive tropes. There are these two paths for the adoptee in Victorian literature in particular. An adoptee either comes in and kind of saves and restores the family. Like sometimes, typically families that don't have biological children. And then there's this other path, and she spends some time talking about kind of the more famous example, which is Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights, where an adoptee comes in to create chaos and destroy a home. And so, again, she is kind of holding up the stories that they tell and the kind of their own family narrative around these tropes, and seeing the ways in which these stories fit and the ways in which they don't. And I think she's ultimately, I don't know how explicitly she says this, but, also exploring kind of a third path of a home kind of in the middle, caught in a constant cycle, like many homes of kind of like restoration and chaos and reconstruction and destruction. That these two paths in life are not always so clear. They veer off into side paths unmarked. And so, again, to your point, in many ways it is about this family, but she's constantly kind of holding them up to the light to understand how they fit or don't fit within the larger context and the way that adoption has been traditionally represented or understood or portrayed.
And I thought it was interesting how much compassion you held for this family, while not necessarily withholding criticism, like showing them in all their messiness. And how, there's this one scene where I think it's like the table is littered with like adoption pamphlets and like research galore, and the father, who I just like absolutely loved, at one point is like pretending to be someone from the senator's office in order to like get everything, and just how much this family loved both their children. And then you say at the same time, I think in that same scene, something like, they didn't realize the blank space or the blind spot of like things that they hadn't considered and they hadn't talked about. And that resonated for me, because like that's every family, it's interesting. It's only in doing a project like this that we sometimes see our blind spots. And I thought the narrator did such an interesting job without like falling into tropes, but showing the way that like maybe their family had fallen into these stereotypes at times, and then in other ways they had resisted them, and what she kind of learned about them throughout time, and how that ultimately was affecting her as she was deciding. Because this other layer of the book, right, is she initially thinks that she doesn't want to have children. And I thought it was interesting the way you write about, she talks about being in her 30s and getting this unexpected pain, her and both her husband, where they're really rethinking that. And she's in this interesting position where she has a lot of personal experience with adoption, but at the time her and her husband decide to pursue IVF. And that's this other thing that she's struggling to talk about with Danny. And that was something we talked about in our book club group, how sometimes with our loved ones, like there's the really difficult thing we want to talk about, and we'll find like any other way to try to like get at it besides asking the question. Like I think at one time she asked Danny, like, what would you think if I adopted, rather than saying, what would you think if I didn't adopt? So I don't know, maybe you can just talk a little bit about how you imbued the narrator with this desire for motherhood and also this ambivalence around it. And there's this one line, I think Danny says at one point, like, people never, like, everyone always says like the fucking wrong thing, or like no one ever says the right thing. And it was funny, the things, funny and awful, the things that people say, like to her at one point, like don't hope too much or something. And she's like, what is hoping too much, But maybe you can just talk
impossible
a little bit
thing.
Yeah, how you kind of balance the narrator's feelings around like motherhood, and how you like thought that through.
Definitely. So I think the book is there's kind of this question around like, what is a mother? And I think she travels down a couple different paths to explore it. I don't know that she ever lands on an exact answer. But I think, one thing that she's really scratching at is this kind of like pre-motherhood time that she's in. I think that maybe she feels isn't talked about as often. The waiting and the longing and the yearning to become a mother. And, could this be part of motherhood too? Is that what this is? And in this experience, she's also kind of looking to her own mother and having kind of whether it's appreciation or just taking a new kind of lens on her mother's experience waiting through the adoption process for 5 years for her brother. And so in that way, the book, while the book doesn't end with a baby in her arms, I would argue that it's still a motherhood book, because I think the narrator is arguing that this is still a part of motherhood, this waiting and this longing, and this yearning and this preparing your body and preparing yourself. So there's that aspect. And then I think, there's this kind of other thread that she's thinking about motherhood through the lens of her relationship with her brother. I mean, if there are any older siblings on the call, they probably would also agree that there's this kind of inevitable feeling of like the ghost of a parent in an older sibling relationship, even though it would probably make most younger siblings really upset to hear someone be called a parent when you're also not. And so she's thinking about her kind of relationship as a future caretaker for her brother as an older sibling in a future where their parents are gone. And she says, at one point, I don't know what scares me most, the idea of life without children or life without our parents, or being the only parent you have left. And so she's thinking a lot too about kind of the weight of that responsibility and how that might shift in years to come in their relationship. And so there's, I think she's looking at kind of like the gray space of what is a mother or the role of an older sister to her brother as they kind of continue their lives together. And then I think the last piece is just, there's a lot of shame that she's exploring around her body. She talks a lot about kind of the emotional grief of the fertility process, but she also, I think, goes into a lot of like the physical grief around her body and not being able to kind of do this thing, this biological thing that she's in theory supposed to do. And so in feeling this kind of grief in her body, she feels very chemically altered from the hormones and the treatments. There's also this kind of, at times, like fictional mirroring that's happening, where she's looking back in those moments and also thinking about or recalling kind of almost out of nowhere moments where she's seen her brother feel uncomfortable in his skin, growing up as a person of color in a white family in a white town. And while she would never call those two experiences the same in any way, I think that's kind of one of the nice things about fiction, is that they're able to take this kind of like asymmetrical look at each other, and there is like a mirroring of those experiences happening, even though they're different, that they're both kind of going through this grief in their own separate ways. And so I think she's also looking at that through this process of motherhood. Again, she's also seeing her brother in there somehow unexpectedly.
Yeah, you brought up waiting, and I thought that sometimes in a book, when characters are waiting for something to happen, it can be extremely frustrating as a reader, but there was so much narrative tension that really compelled me forward. And there was this one line that I really loved. It's towards the end of the book. I think it's page 163, where the narrator says, I asked her mother what she remembered of the wait, and she said she remembered it like most remember pain. The hurt was white hot at the time, practically blinding, but the memory would never reproduce the feeling, like labor or betrayal. And I thought that was such a poignant way of putting it. And also, to your point, as the narrator was kind of thinking through what it meant to be a mother, I thought it was both heartbreaking and made so much sense as she was comparing herself to both of her parents in terms of the way they parented her and the way they parented Danny. And I think there was ways she was so different. Like the father, she realizes, has this moment at the end, like the father is always going to bail Danny out, like no matter what. And she's like, I don't know if that's going to be me, And the mother, she has this really interesting kind of moment at the end where she talks about, like any mother, real or imagined, ours contain 1,000 lives we'll never know. And right before this, she's talking about, this is on page 167, and here's a woman who never lived with the fear that your birth mother would come back for you, but did her best to navigate the absence, the second original sin. And I thought, like, on top of everything else, there were these complex portrayals of how the father and the mother showed up, and then how the narrator is like weighing her against these two parents and kind of realizing, like, maybe I won't ever be like that version. But it's like at the end where she says, the door will always be open to Danny, but it's kind of like this, like you said, like grief and maybe a letting go of the ways that like we're not going to show up as a mother or however else, whether she has a child or doesn't. But I thought that like the ways the narrator was comparing herself, not necessarily directly, but to her mom and her dad, was really really poignant, but in a compassionate way where you just also felt for these parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think little is kind of explicitly said, but you do get a sense, I hope anyway, of kind of a moving on or of a forgiveness towards the end, both for both of them in terms of, this fracture in the relationship, but also kind of a moving on and a forgiveness of her own body. She spends a lot of the book angry at it and frustrated with it, and herself and even her husband and those around her at times, because everyone remains so physically unchanged by this process except her in her mind. But I think she, as you mentioned, kind of through thinking about all these things, she finds a peace with it at the end, kind of in her own subtle way. So
I think the other thing that was interesting about the setup of the book is like, not only was she speaking to Danny, but she was speaking to Danny in this very specific way where she was been asked to give a wedding toast. So that adds this whole another layer where we're also thinking about, well, what's the meaning of marriage and of being wed together. And I think Danny asked her a couple of times, like what it's like to be married. And I thought the relationship between her and her husband and what we see of that is really interesting as well. And one of my favorite passages in the whole book, I'm sorry I keep reading your book to you, is page 145, where she's talking about, she says, I'd say that to be married is to make peace with all you cannot see as hard as you try. At the end of the page, I don't know if mystery is the thing that holds people in love, though, or the way one sits in a chair. I don't know if it's the absence of familiar pain in a person or the recognition of one. And for everyone, this is the scene where I think she's wearing a heart monitor or something at this point, and she can't like wash her hair, so her husband's helping her wash her hair. And at the end of the scene, like he leaned over to pat my hair dry, and I thought, thank God sometimes we're wrong about things, because she's saying like I was crazy to think that marriage wasn't for me. And I think like another thread of the book is just the narrator trying to make sense of like what binds someone to someone else, and what does marriage mean, and what so how is that like a whole nother thing that you thought about that thread of the book, and like how did you think about the husband's relationship, who's never even named in the book, but like how much of a real character did he become to you, and how did you think about their relationship developing over the course of this kind of wedding toast to the brother?
yeah, that's such a good question. I feel like you talked about it more smartly than I did. So but what can I say? What can I say? I mean, I think that in original drafts, actually, to be honest, the husband wasn't as present because the more that I kind of wrote and rewrote the book, peripheral characters would come up, and then they ultimately would be edited out. I mean, this really is, the book is called Immediate Family, and it really is kind of centralized around the core unit of her and her brother and her parents. And so it was surprising to me actually in later drafts that he got as much airtime as he did. But I think that, he is kind of an important character in helping her understand her own isolation in this process. Really, I mean, I mentioned in the beginning there are things that are hard to talk about between her and her brother, but she doesn't even have kind of a language for this thing that's happening in her own body and in her own home with her partner. And so, yeah, I think that he's also kind of like many characters in the book, a point of tension and then also a point of tenderness. She's kind of trying to connect and then she's disconnecting, and they, I think ultimately they find their way to each other, but it is also kind of this grief around this is kind of a third person that's entered their house, a new shape that's entered their house, and she's grappling with that. And the, what's it like to be married is kind of this, what's the word I'm looking for? It's repeated throughout the book. And I think she continues to try to answer it because there are like so many shades of an answer to that question. And she feels like she keeps maybe getting it wrong or not getting exactly at the thing. And so I hope by the end she starts to give him a little bit more of an honest portrait of what she's kind of learned in this process. But yeah, ultimately the husband didn't get too much of the axe on the other board, so that's good.
And I think too, there's this passage where you talk about grief and love being tied together, and how sometimes love, I don't know the exact wording, you write it way better, but something about like love being like filled by these like griefs or informed by it. And I saw that in the marriage and also in her relationship with Danny. And I felt like the other thing that connected them is as the narrator is making sense of these different adoption narratives and family tropes, there's this other thing that surfaced for me, and I think it comes up a couple of times, this idea of change. So it's early in the book, you say something like, there was sadness along with excitement and fear, because change is always tethered to some kind of departure, some send off to a life new. And then towards the end of the book, there's this other line about bright changes being bound up in goodbye. And I thought that was, without like making something very complicated sound trite, but just obviously in life, and sometimes it's like hard to accept, but there are these ruptures or these changes, these things that we grieve or long for that don't happen, and there's some change or something that comes out of it. And I thought that was another interesting thing that the narrator kind of throws out at the end of like looking at this like Victorian literature, this other, like what happens next. And then that's like when there's another marriage, like when there's another immediate family and there's like another chance for life, and not saying that again it's going to be this like magical something, but it is like a new like creation. It's like this family is a living, breathing thing, and it won't remain fixed, even though I think at the end she kind of realizes like things might always be really hard for Danny, and then at the same time like here's this woman who loves him and they're starting a family.
Yeah, I mean, because the book is ultimately, I mean, it's encased by the wedding, right? We don't actually spend a ton of time at the wedding itself. It takes place kind of in her headspace and in her memory. But ultimately, the present moment of the book is at this wedding. And I think to your point, there is a real, maybe not as often talked about, but a real like poignancy to a wedding where everyone is very, happy and celebratory for the couple, but it's also a letting go of some way, for the family or for roommates or loved ones that maybe used to live with these people. And so it's kind of a transition from one core unit to the next core unit. And these are things like, as you really nicely say, that she explores throughout the book. A transition she remembers feeling when it was the three of them, and then even after this long wait of so many years, and then all of a sudden, immediately, now they're four. And so yeah, I think that she kind of explores that through a lot of different shades throughout the book.
Yeah, I also love what you said in the Q&A that we did online about what makes a great wedding toast speech, and it kind of reminded me when you said the letting go. Do you mind repeating that? Because I was like, oh, this is so smart. I need to why aren't other people thinking about this when they're writing wedding toasts?
I don't remember what I said. I'm glad it was smart. I think I said something like, that essentially, I think the best wedding toasts bring the crowd along. That everyone wants to be in on the love story, and even in some ways, maybe they want to feel that poignancy of what you're kind of gifting, or what it is that you're giving away, or you're contributing to the couple that maybe was once yours, a closeness. And I think that the narrator kind of teases herself, maybe it's trite, but she also does in a way feel it with the speech, like she's kind of giving him away as his older sister, and this is why she's thinking about it so much. So I think that kind of poignant piece of a wedding was something that she really focuses on at the end.
Yeah, and I love that. I think about that too so I'm the younger one, I have an older brother, but the intimacy that when I'm with him and his partner, that, intimacy that I have with him that I can now share, and then that they have, and now that I can, be a part of in some ways. And it's a really interesting dynamic, and something that I feel is very special to share. And I don't know that there's other configurations of that are exactly so. So I thought that was a good tip.
Yeah, I was just saying, a new chapter, and also lends itself to a lot of nostalgia sometimes in the way that she's going back and thinking about their life together. So
before I let you go, do you want to talk a little bit about transit books and any books you have coming out that we should be reading, or anything else you're working on? I'm not going to ask if you're writing another novel, because I feel it's maybe a little bit too soon, but if you are, you can let us know.
I'm writing. I'm taking a little bit of a hiatus, but I will write again. Yes, for those of you who aren't familiar with transit, so my husband and I founded the press here in the Bay Area in 2015, and we publish a carefully curated list of 6 to 8 books per year. It's an indie press focused on international literature. And so we have a book that just came out, I think I mentioned it on the Goop site too, that I love, and kind of in the theme of the ambivalence of new motherhood, called Imminence by Mariana Demopoulos, translated by Alice Whitmore. And it's if you like books about the ambivalence of new motherhood, it's an absolute must, and that just came out. And I'd also say check out our Undelivered Lecture series. This is a brand new narrative nonfiction line that we're running, and it is kind of slim, beautiful, handsome editions. These are narrative nonfiction pieces that are longer than a magazine piece, but shorter than kind of a standard paperback or hardback. And they kind of explore this discursive prose around a range of topics, and they're beautiful to hold and beautiful to read. So definitely check them out.
We will. Ashley, thank you so much for writing this beautiful story and for being with us today. We so appreciate it.
Thank you so much for reading.
I'll let you go, and everyone stay for our September pick. But Ashley, was so nice chatting today.
Thank you so much.
And now our September pick is A Farewell to Gabo and Mercedes by Rodrigo Garcia. This is a memoir. We haven't done a memoir in a really long time, since I think Carrie by Toni Jensen, which is a while ago. I admittedly was in a little bit of a reading rut after I finished reading Immediate Family, and I was so happy when this book came along. I cried, I laughed. It's so special. So it is, it's called A Son's Memoir is the subtitle, and it is about Rodrigo's experience growing up as the son of the acclaimed writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his fabulous mother Mercedes. And these two people, his parents, lived an extraordinary life. They both died at the age of 87, a few years apart. And it's about Rodrigo's childhood, and also how he spent the final days with his parents at the ends of their lives, and how he kind of made sense of their stories. And it's surprising and intimate and absorbing. And I think just such a fascinating way of exploring parenthood and, yeah, a beautiful love letter to parents. So I think this will be such a fun read together. There'll be a lot to discuss. A Farewell to Gabo and Mercedes. It is out now. We'll be reading it for September, and you can go to goop.com/goop book club. We have an excerpt from the book up, a Q&A with Rodrigo, and you can join our Facebook group. I will be back here, what's the date? On September 30th at 5 p.m. LA time, 8 p.m. Eastern time, talking with Rodrigo, which I am super excited about. So thank you all for joining today, and we will see you next time. All right, bye.